Welcome to the presentation on highlights of the Municipal Solid Waste Landfill Rules Package. I am Annetta Haviland with the Ohio EPA Division of Materials and Waste Management. The slides are available for your reference at the division's website under the What's New tab, announcing the presentation, and the session is recorded and will be available to attendees through Teams for 180 days. I want to do some introductions first. I have with me Michelle Mountjoy, who is our Division Rules Coordinator, and Brian Queen from our Southeast District Office, who helped research a lot of the particulars in these rules. And they will be monitoring the chat for your questions, which we will answer at the end. I want to stress that I am going through the highlights of the rule changes, not every change. What I did is for each rule, I picked out the biggest changes. Overall, we removed duplication. We streamlined processes. For example, where appropriate, we swapped director for Ohio EPA. That gives us more flexibility in deciding how to process various authorizations. And then just general improvement in language and structure. To find a version of the rules that shows all the changes, you can go to the Register of Ohio website. So I've been using this site quite a bit lately. When you go to the website, there's a search box. You put in the rule number, for example, 3745-27-08, and you will get a screen that looks like this, and the red button under rule, that's what you would click on, and you would see the rule edits, the struck out old language and the underlined new language. So some people want to see those edits. Otherwise, the complete rule is available on our agency webpage. So these are the rules that were involved in this particular package. What they have in common is that they are left over from other rule updating efforts. Overall, very little in the rule changes will affect your day-to-day requirements. At this point, I will point out that in the closure rule that there is a changed requirement that you should pay attention to. For post-closure care, it might look like we added a lot of new requirements. I think it is more adding of details because for the most part, facilities were doing this stuff anyway. The big changes will be to authorization requests. So if you do beneficial use projects, through the Integrated Alternative Waste Management Program, also known as IOWAMP. There's some changes in information there, or if you are requesting a permit. So more on that later. I do want to share with you some other rulemaking efforts that we have made and are in the process to kind of put this package in context. The next step for the Municipal Solid Waste Landfill program is to migrate that program over to its new home in the 500s. It'll be 500 something. We've done that already with the composting program and with the transfer facility program. So the municipal solid waste program will be coming up next. We've already started on the operational rules. So you may have already seen an early stakeholder outreach notification to that effect. The explosive gas monitoring rule is the last rule to be updated, and we're really getting close to picking an effective date on that. And that is the last rule. The PE rule, which was effective on December 1st, there's actually no change in the PE requirements. We're basically moving the triggering requirement out of a rule that kind of aggregated all of the documents that needed a PE stamp and seal, and we're putting that requirement where that document is addressed. So not changing the requirement, we're just moving things around a bit. Eventually, the PE rule, which is 3745-27-99, will disappear. And then the last package I wanted to let you know about is the RD&D, which is the Research, Development, and Demonstration Project rule. That is something that Subtitle D allows states to administer for bioreactor landfills where additional liquids need to be brought in to kick off that bioreactor reaction in the landfill. We adopted those rules 10 years ago, and in that time, no one has asked to do an RD&D project in Ohio. So we put out a notice that we are considering rescinding that program, and so far we haven't received any objections to us doing that. US EPA will be coming out, I don't know when, but they will be coming out with a federal program to actually make liquid addition permanent in some form or fashion. So the effective date for the rules in this package is January 1st of 2021. And here I'm going to start going through each of the rules and their highlights. So for Rule 02, there are other changes, but I did want to point out that if you notice the deletion of the triggers considered modification of a transfer facility, it's not that it is totally deleted. As I mentioned earlier, the transfer facility program migrated to its new home in the 500s. And so the definition of modify is located in that transfer facility program. That's actually Chapter 555. That way we only have the one definition or the one description of what triggers a modification of a transfer facility. So the next rule is 05. We reference TNORM, which is technologically enhanced, naturally occurring radioactive material. So we do recognize that rules are coming up to regulate that material, and that rule also recognizes our new beneficial use program and cites to those rules in that chapter. So I had mentioned that if somebody is coming in with a beneficial use request, there are changes to the application form if it is a beneficial use that's considered an IOWMP, not one of the beneficial uses that are actually addressed specifically in that program. But if you're doing something else, then it comes in as an IOWMP request. So now we're asking for added parcel numbers and impact of recurring disposal. So you can be sure to look for those changes if you do any sort of beneficial use activities that aren't actually addressed in the beneficial use rules. The permit application rule 06, we did not change any of the process to our permit program, but the content of the permit, that is addressed by other rules 07 and 08, and they're just basically captured in 06. So I'll get into the details on those changes when I go through 07 and 08. So 07 is next. Since 06, 07, and 08 pertain to the permit, the changes that I'm going over now, don't think that you need to comply with them right now. That's not the case. They're going to apply if you're coming in with a permit request or depending on what you are altering at your facility, they may come into play with an alteration request. So the big change for siting criteria is that where it used to apply to the entire facility, that was changed to apply to sources of contamination. So it will now say something like X feet away from not the facility, but from the limits of waste placement, leachate storage structures, and it will list the actual sources of contamination that siting criterion is to apply to. Now, we made a lot of changes to the construction rule in 2008. And as I said, as I go through this, keep in mind that these will be requirements associated with a permit application. But if there are some things that you are considering altering, then some of these changes may also come into play for you. Now, an exception to all that happens to be transitional cover. That is one engineered component that the operational rule, Rule 19, actually says if you're going to use transitional cover, you need to comply with Rule 8. So that's the one exception to only permit with what I'm going to say. And in this case, since there were so many significant changes to 2008, I have orange font stuff, which is like the really big changes. So one of the changes that we made is the factor of safety for undrained static slope stability. That was reduced from 1.5 to 1.3. And it used to be that we did not accept deformation analysis when it came to seismic slope stability. We will now accept that approach for determining stability of a landfill. It used to be we required 3 survey marks. We're now just going to require 1. And here's the first big change that I wanted to bring to your attention: piping failure due to seepage forces. All along, we've had hydrostatic calculations, but we've still had a couple of landfills through the years in Ohio that have actually experienced damage to the foundation or to the liner due to piping failure, because the seepage forces weren't adequately accounted for. So we've added specifically in rule points to address this piping failure phenomenon. For added geologic material, the permeability specification that you might be familiar with will not apply if you are using a lean clay. So if you're using a non-CL soil, that is when we want to see what the permeability is for that material, that there is a spec that will be applied. But as long as you're using a lean clay, we believe the lean clay is just going to be adequate on its own to be an added geologic material. Then the next orange item is that we reduced the thickness of the recompacted soil liner from 5 feet to 3 feet. And so as a consequence, Appendix 1 is removed from the rule. We actually don't need that anymore. And the reason that we were able to reduce the thickness of the recompacted soil liner is that we've made a lot of improvements to construction of the flexible membrane liner, which I'll be going over shortly. But I do want to address alterations for a thinner recompacted soil liner, because it sounds like there might be a lot of people that are interested in doing that at their facility. So if you are not expanding the limits of solid waste placement, it is indeed an alteration. But if the limits of solid waste are extending beyond their authorized limits, that is considered a modification, and a permit to modify the facility will be required. Now, the reason that we're able to reduce the thickness of the recompacted soil liner is because of the FML construction practices. So you might think you're only altering the recompacted soil liner, but we see it as a system, that you are altering your composite liner system. So that's why these upcoming changes to the flexible membrane liner, you will also need to be aware of and take account of. So we added an experience standard for FML installation. It will be similar to the International Association of Geosynthetic Installers. So if you're familiar with their standards, then this will look pretty familiar to you as well. We added a requirement to clean the FML prior to seaming. And here's another big item. We added electrical leak location surveys. In our initial proposal, our initial draft of the rule, we were asking to have that done twice. Once on the exposed FML, make sure that any pinhole leaks would be discovered, and then again after the leachate collection system is installed to check for any subsequent damage that might have occurred during that construction activity. We're now just requiring it once after the leachate collection system has been placed. And the add electrical leak location survey does not apply to the CAP system. And along with that, we have a 4-inch standard for the flexible membrane liner wrinkle height. That's not to say that we no longer have zero tolerance for maintaining intimate contact. That is still in there, but having this 4 inches in the rules does provide a measurable standard for construction practices. So when you look out across a sheet of FML and you see a 4-inch wrinkle, that doesn't mean that that's in violation of the construction standard. It gets to be an issue if that 4-inch wrinkle is right where you're about to place your gravel or your leachate collection system. That wrinkle can't be more than 4 inches. And what a lot of contractors do is they just simply apply a weight to flatten that wrinkle. It could be a sandbag, temporary sandbag, or just standing on the wrinkle, but that is where this wrinkle requirement applies, is just before weight is put on top of that wrinkle. Some other changes to the construction rule is we have added specifications for leachate ponds. We have a primary and secondary liner with leak detection. We have a provision in there for liner protection and a freeboard standard. When it comes to transitional cover, remember transitional cover will apply to all facilities as soon as the rule goes into effect because of the way that the operational rule points back to Rule 08. So the transitional cover specifications, we are no longer using the agricultural classification system for that soil. We do have a grain size standard that has replaced that. So it could very well be that that change would not impact your soil choice, but that is a change that we did make to that rule. When it comes to final cap, the cap soil barrier layer, we simplified the grain size distribution on that. We're focusing on the number 4 standard mesh screen. And then for the cap protection layer soil, the permeability of that soil needs to conform to the slope stability needs. So back in the permit application where all that is calculated out, the soil permeability needs to meet what that calculation said was necessary to have a stable slope in the cap. So now moving on to the operating record. There's a paragraph in there which addressed transition for very old existing facilities back before there even was an operating record and how to get them started on an operating record. So we don't have any facilities in that situation any longer, so all those instructions are gone. And then there had been a requirement to mail copies of updated documents to us. And for the most part, we are reviewing those documents before they're actually updated. So you don't need to be sending us another copy of what we just reviewed. And for those things that we may not necessarily review up front, we can always ask that that document be provided to us. So we removed that requirement because we figured it was kind of redundant in most cases. And something else I wanted to add here, it's not a rule change in the operating rule, but an interpretation change. It used to be in the past that some documents required that they had to be hard copies. We're now willing to accept electronic versions for all the documents and the operating record, but if it has an approved stamp on it, the electronic version needs to show the stamp. And when we update the guidance document for operating records, you will see that explained. For the closure rule, this is the big change, which you will need to make note of, is that instead of putting a notice in the paper that the facility will be closing, that's gone. That is replaced with a sign at the facility announcing that the facility will be closing. So if you put the notice in the paper, that's good. You've gone above and beyond what the rule requires. But if you do not put the sign up, then that would be a violation. So do make note of that. And for post-closure care, as I said, we added more details. They might look like new requirements, but for the most part, they are activities that people have been doing all along anyway. So added to the care or to the list of items to provide post-closure care to, we moved things that were in the Operations Rule 19 into Rule 14 rather than referencing Rule 19. So this covers maintenance of access roads, maintaining stability, and we also added a measurable vegetation standard, sort of like what we did with the wrinkles, but we did it for the amount of vegetation that we want to see out there. And we created a list of items to look for during the quarterly inspections. Oh, and we also added in the post-closure care rule some information about how to end or extend post-closure care activities on like a piecemeal basis. So we're open to doing that all along. Now we have a rule that explains that, yes, if there's one thing in particular that needs further care, we can extend post-closure care for that item. But if there's other things that aren't needed any longer, we can cease care for those other items. The backup pump requirement, that's been replaced with a need to replace any broken down pumps within 24 hours. And to the annual report, we want to get some assessment as far as changes to the surrounding area. So if you do have any questions, if they are of a general nature, you can always get in touch with me. But if you have a site-specific question, say how a particular item in the rule applies to your facility, you really ought to call the appropriate district office because they'll know best the ins and outs of that facility rather than giving you a sort of a generic answer. They can give you an answer that's more specific. So we're on to questions that may have come in on the chat.